Have you ever watched a UFC fight or a boxing match? Better yet, have you ever watched a boxing match with the world heavyweight title on the line or a UFC fight for that weight division's belt? Watching a world title fight is like watching two gorillas with the grace of ballerinas do everything they can to destroy each other. It's a little intense, a little bit brutal, but ultimately captivating. Now, have you ever noticed what happens in between the rounds in one of these fights? That moment when the fighter, who just a moment before was filled with aggression and the will to destroy, plops himself down on a stool, drinks some water, and gets some advice from his coaches. We're talking about the best fighters in the world, experts in their craft with thousands of hours of experience under their belt, sitting on a stool in the middle of a battle, getting advice. Now, the same type of thing happens all across sports. The Chicago Bulls call a timeout with just seconds left in an NBA Finals game to gather as a team and come up with a plan. Tiger Woods consults his caddy before sinking a tournament-winning putt. In the world of sports, in the world of competition, the people in your corner, the people on your team determine how far you can go. The people in your corner, the people on your team, they determine the direction of your future. And I think the same thing is true in everyday life. You see, even though none of us are competing for a national championship, it's still true that the people in our corner, the people on our team, determine how far we can go. They determine the direction of our future. In Proverbs 11, we read, "Where no counsel is, the people fail. But in the multitude of counselors, there is safety." You see, it's a biblical principle that the people we surround ourselves with determine our future. And so over the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at 3 types of people you need to surround yourself with if you want to go far and in the right direction. In this video and this week, we're going to talk about friendships. Our friends, the people we choose to spend time with, even when we don't have to, can have a huge impact on the direction and quality of our life. Now, maybe you've heard the saying, show me your friends and I'll show you your future. For me, there's one friendship in my life that stands above the rest. Outside of my wife, my best friend Garrett is one of the people who knows me the best in the whole world. Now, you've got to understand, Garrett was my youth pastor growing up, so we have a little bit of a unique relationship. But we first met when I was 9 or 10 years old, so he's one of the few people outside my family that I've known closely for over a decade. Garrett's one of those people that's a source of joy, fun, and laughter wherever he goes, but more than that, he's been a steady, constant presence for me. I remember being in high school and Garrett giving me the opportunity to preach my first ever sermon. He sat with me as we outlined it together and talked me through how to preach to people in a way that makes Jesus relevant and real. I look back on some of the biggest decisions I've made in my life, and Garrett was always on the short list of people I'd call to get solid, Christ-like advice. He didn't always tell me what I wanted to hear, but he always said what I needed to hear. I hope and pray that you have somebody like Garrett in your life, because I know that without his friendship, the direction of my life, the quality of my life would be completely different. The people in our corner determine how far we can go. They determine the direction of our future. There's a story in the New Testament in the Gospel of Mark that I think illustrates this idea powerfully. In Mark chapter 2, Jesus has just begun his ministry. He's only called a few of the disciples, but he's already starting to get a reputation as a healer and a teacher. In Mark 2, we pick up the story as Jesus comes back to his home base in Capernaum, and something incredible happens. Let's read it together. A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. They gathered in such large numbers that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralyzed man, carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus by digging through it, and then they lowered the mat the man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now, some teachers of the law were sitting there thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like that? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately, Jesus knew in his spirit that this is what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to this paralyzed man, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat, and walk? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. So he said to the man, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. And this amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, we have never seen anything like this. Now, there's a lot of things we could break down here. There's a ton of cultural and historical information that helps us understand this passage more fully, but I want to focus on one verse as we talk about the importance of friendship. Verse 5 reads, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, son, your sins are forgiven. Remember, Jesus is teaching in a city where he's quickly becoming famous. A crowd is gathering to hear him teach. And here's where friendship comes in. A group of men hear that Jesus is in town and decide that he's the only one who could heal their paralyzed friend. So they pick up their friend, carrying him through the town on his mat to go see Jesus. When they show up on the scene, they realize there's no chance that they'll be able to work their way through the crowd. But instead of giving up, they fight their way around the house. They climb the stairs up to the roof and dig a hole in the ceiling and start lowering their friend down on top of Jesus. Imagine being in the crowd that day. Imagine what this would have looked like as these four dudes. They've interrupted Jesus' teaching and are lowering down the town beggar on a mat. But here's the important part. Verse 5 tells us, when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, son, your sins are forgiven. When Jesus saw their faith, when Jesus saw the faith of the friends, he forgave the sins of the paralyzed man. We're not told whether the paralyzed man said anything. We're not told that he was sorry for his sin. We're not even told that he believed Jesus could heal him, but none of that matters. When Jesus sees the faith of the friends, he forgives and eventually heals the paralyzed man. Do you see the importance of the friends you have? The paralyzed man's friends determined the direction of his future. Without their intervention, without their determination, without their faith, he would have stayed at the city gate, sitting on a mat, begging for enough money to buy a single meal for the rest of his life. But because his friends took action, because they had faith, his future was changed forever. So I want to ask you, do you have friends that would carry you to Jesus? Do you have friends that would carry you to Jesus? Or do you have friends that encourage you to walk away from him? Are your friends the type of people who help you become more and more like Jesus? Or are your friends the kind of people who encourage your bad habits? Maybe your friends are pretty neutral about life, apathetic and ambivalent towards everything. What would happen if you and I decided to spend the majority of our time, the majority of our relational energy surrounding ourselves with people who help carry us towards Jesus instead of away from him? Let me ask you another question. What kind of friend are you? Do you carry people towards Jesus or away from him? Do you help people take steps to become more like Jesus, or do you encourage other people's bad habits and bad choices? Are you the kind of friend who's reliable, caring, and selfless, or are you only available when it's convenient, when you feel like it? What would your relationships, what would your friendships look like if you started carrying people towards Jesus? Imagine the impact you could have in your circle of influence. Remember, the people in your corner determine how far you can go. The people in your corner determine the direction of your future. So I want to challenge you. Are the people in your corner, are your friends the kind of people who carry you towards Jesus or away from him? Because the answer to that question may determine what your future looks like. I'm going to turn it back over to Nick and Spencer. I hope you guys have a great small group discussion. I'll see you next week.